Good evening, this is your tropical weather update for Sunday, June 10th. Nothing imminent is brewing in the Atlantic Basin tropics, so we will begin in the eastern Pacific, where the National Hurricane Center is monitoring an area of low pressure that they still consider has a 60% chance of developing within the next 2 days. Their outlook also states that conditions are favorable out ahead of this disturbance, as you can see here spinning about on the visible satellite between 10 and 15 degrees north latitude and 110 and 115 degrees west longitude. But look out toward the west, we see that there's a lot of wind shear, and although it's not impacting the area of low pressure at this time, it will begin to inhibit more development over the next 24 to 48 hours. So if development does occur, it will have to be within the next day or so, and quickly thereafter it will dissipate. So we're still not too worried about that particular disturbance. Now moving on into the other portions of the eastern Pacific to the south of Mexico and Central America, there are no additional active disturbances, but the models are keeping the intertropical convergence zone somewhat active out here over the next 7 days, so this will be an area that has to be monitored. Moving more eastward into the Atlantic Basin, we see that the Gulf, Caribbean, and West Atlantic are void of any significant shower and storm activity, but we're still dealing with some heavy rain along the U.S. Central Gulf Coast. And in fact, within the last 36 hours, an observation just to the west of Pensacola, Florida, has recorded over 21.7 inches of rainfall, which is just a ridiculous amount of precipitation. It looks as though the heavy rainfall threat will persist into at least tomorrow morning. Right now we are in a bit of a gap, but we can't rule out at least one more round of significant rainfall, so be on the lookout for that. But after tomorrow it should begin to taper down a little bit back toward your normal 40 to 50% summertime rainfall chances. And also out toward the west, the flood watches for portions of Louisiana and Mississippi have already been canceled. If we look into the future using the latest 12Z run of the Canadian CMC model, you can tell that the model is not too thrilled about the prospects for any tropical development in the Atlantic Basin, but it does keep the intertropical convergence zone active across the eastern Pacific, so any area of low pressure that develops out there will have to be watched for signs of tropical development. As of right now, it's keeping all of these features to the south of the Mexican coastline. Meanwhile, the latest run from the GFS has similar prospects out into the eastern Pacific. In fact, it does develop a new area of low pressure into a tropical depression or tropical storm as it begins to move a little bit more toward the northwest and then begins to parallel the Mexican coastline. So that definitely bears some monitoring over the next few days, and it keeps the Atlantic Basin quiet, much like the Canadian CMC. Although by day 7, much like yesterday, we still see a very broad area of low pressure sitting to the south of Cuba. This could have to be monitored down the road, but the models are still not overly enthused about development prospects just yet. Finally, the latest run from the ECMWF model is somewhat similar to yesterday's run with a few subtle changes. This is the day 6 850 millibar forecast moving into day 7. You can see much like yesterday, it is still developing a storm out here in the eastern Pacific, but the track is a little bit more toward the south and away from Mexico. I will show you why in just a moment. And as we go into days 8 and 9, the area of low pressure that was forecast to develop near the Yucatan Peninsula isn't quite as well defined as we saw in yesterday's model run, but this area will still have to be monitored potentially down the road, while the eastern Pacific storm is still forecast to remain offshore. So if we take a bit of a deeper look at the overall steering pattern and compare to what we saw yesterday, in yesterday's run the model was a lot more amplified with this trough over the western United States, and the more amplified trough would have suggested a more northerly track from any Pacific storm that develops, but instead we begin to see more in the way of ridging returning to the desert southwest. And as long as this ridging were to verify in the model, this is going to help keep any Pacific storm on a more westerly track, which would certainly be some good news. And also the favorable pattern that supports Gulf of Mexico and Western Caribbean mischief with more ridging in the central United States. Well, I tell you what, that solution is not being advertised as much as it was yesterday. Instead, we're seeing more of a trough out across Minneapolis and Minnesota. And as we go into day 9, this trough is really beginning to beat down any ridge that is located over the Great Lakes or even the northeast United States. So although the potential is still there to some extent, as you can see with the area of low pressure still trying to get itself going across the central Gulf, the potential isn't quite as high in the models as it was at this time yesterday. So we are 10 days into the official start of hurricane season, but we're looking fairly good at this time. Just continue to keep it posted to 28storms.com and the Hurricane Tracker app. As we all know by now, things can change in a hurry in the tropics.